The famous Big Week, the beginning of one of the most brutal air battles of World War II. Here, as B-17 flying fortresses roar towards Germany, Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters are climbing, headed to defend their homeland. The coming clash would see dogfights and intense air engagements spread all across Europe. But in particular, one tale stands out, that of a ball turret gunner who, with no other options, was forced to climb into the cockpit and, with almost no training, try and bring his crippled bomber home across hundreds of miles of hostile skies, creating one of the most harrowing tales in the history of aerial combat. As we are about to see in a few moments, we owe a great deal of debt to the brave men in stories like this. But unfortunately, today, many Americans feel like they have other debts as well. But these come from credit cards, medical bills, or personal loans. Thankfully though, for those types of debts, we have PDS Debt, the sponsor of this video. They've helped more than 100,000 people just like you. But PDS Debt does more than just help you manage your debt. They empower you to take back control. With their technology, they go beyond the numbers to understand your unique financial situation. No more cookie-cutter solutions, just a clear path to financial freedom that fits your lifestyle. And here's the best part, there's no minimum credit score required. Whether your credit is bad or fair, they're here to help you save more, pay off your debt faster, and start putting your money back where it belongs, into your savings account. So don't wait around any longer. Getting started is easy. Go to pdsdebt.com/TJ3 History to complete your free debt assessment and see what options are available to you. Anyone with enough eligible debt qualifies. Thanks again to PDS Debt, and now on to the story. It is the beginning of 1944, and finally, after months of losses, buildup, and failures, the United States 8th Air Force is finally ready to put up a well-defended force over occupied Europe to bomb Hitler into submission and finish the mighty Luftwaffe. The first step of this plan would be Big Week, a week-long series of raids that would see the largest air armadas ever assembled flying over the Reich to strike the heart of German industrial power and lure the Luftwaffe up into a fight of attrition. This would begin on February 20th of 1944. At air bases all across England, bomber and fighter groups are now preparing for the start of this plan, codenamed Operation Argument. One such base would be Polbrook, the home of the 351st Bomb Group. Early that morning, the bomber crews were awoken and sent to the briefing room, where they were shown the target for this mission, a long red line leading to Leipzig, Germany, where factories were located that produced Messerschmitt 109 fighters. These factories would be the target of the 351st. 20 of her B-17s started up at Polbrook that morning, assigned to the low group of the 94th Combat Wing. In the lineup for that day was a fortress by the name of 10 horsepower, flown by 2nd Lieutenant Clarence Nelson. In the cockpit with him as co-pilot was Flight Officer Ronald Bartley. 10 horsepower would be assigned to fly here, on the right wing of the group leader. But this wasn't meant to be. As 10 horsepower was taxiing to the runway at Polbrook that morning, one of her wheels was caught in the England mud and became stuck. As the group continued their takeoff, Lieutenant Nelson and his crew had to watch the rest of the 351st go wheels up, while grounds crews worked to free his B-17. Eventually, they would succeed. But by now, 10 horsepower was almost an hour behind schedule and was forced to increase throttle to catch up with the group. Luckily, they were able to do so and rejoin the group. But fatefully, they would have to take a new position in the formation, latching on to the low element as the tail in Charlie. After traveling over the Netherlands and then Germany, the group closed in on Leipzig.
Flak had begun to appear in the sky around them, but it was inaccurate at the moment, not giving the bombers too much to worry about. Just a few minutes from the initial point, however, something was sighted in the sky in front. From 12 o'clock high, a massive group of German fighters approached, numbering more than 40 according to the group's post-mission report. The bandits were primarily Messerschmitt 109s, but Focke-Wulfs were also present in the swarm of interceptors. With elite aces still in their ranks, these German pilots were indeed skilled, and apparently had clearly been taught the methods of Egon Meyer, attacking fortress formations from head-on, allowing for higher closing speed and aiming for the cockpit, in hopes of taking out the pilots, rather than having to beat the rugged bomber out of the sky. Here we can take a look at the post-mission diagram from the survivors of the 351st, showing just how many aircraft recorded that they were attacked, and that the vast majority of these attacks taken on the raid to Leipzig were indeed frontal. In one of these first passes, a cannon from a German fighter was fired, and it would find its target, entering the cockpit window of 10 horsepower.
Now, this description is going to be a little bit brutal, but we have to follow it in detail as this single hit sets up the rest of the story. According to reports, the bullet entered the cockpit window where it struck co-pilot Ronald Bartley in the head, killing him instantly. But then it ricocheted off the armor plate behind him where it hit Lieutenant Nelson, the pilot, in his face.
In a single shot, both pilot and co-pilot were now hit, and 10 horsepower had no one at the controls. Miraculously though, before he fell unconscious, Lieutenant Nelson hit the bailout alarm, which the bombardier, Joe Martin, followed immediately, jettisoning the bombs and leaping from the nose of the aircraft. With no one left actively flying the bomber, 10 horsepower drifted into a spiral and began to dive.
For some reason, instead of following the bailout order, the top turret gunner, Sergeant Carl Moore, opted to instead make his way to the cockpit and try to regain control of the aircraft. Perhaps as he tried to exit, he saw the pilot and co-pilot still in their seats, as he was about to leave, and chose to instead try to help them. But regardless of the reason, Moore leapt into the cockpit as the bomber fell and took control of 10 horsepower, leveling it out after falling 15,000 feet.
Upon realizing what had happened, the ball turret gunner, Sergeant Archie Matthews, also made his way up from his position and joined Moore in the cockpit. After physically having to move the co-pilot's deceased body from the seat, he took over the controls of the aircraft as Moore and another crew member tended to their pilot, who was critically wounded but still alive. The crew was now in quite a predicament. They had on their hands a dead co-pilot and a bombardier who had already bailed out, as well as a pilot who was critically wounded, leaving only the gunners left to fly the plane.
Fortunately though, according to the crew members' later retelling of the story, Captain Nelson had felt it necessary to ensure that all his crew members learned the basic controls of the aircraft in training, just in case they should ever have to take over during a combat mission. They each had about 2 hours of time assisting in the cockpit, which paled in comparison to the hundreds of hours that fully trained pilots had. But at this moment, it was far better than nothing.
To make matters worse, the plane had taken serious damage throughout the cockpit and internal structure of the bomber, which only made flight more challenging. And now they were at just a few thousand feet of altitude, with a long way left to friendly territory. After discussing their options, it was clear that there was no other option but to fly back to England in the shortest route possible, rather than their assigned path back, which was designed to avoid the worst flak areas in Germany. Thus, they embarked on a straight line back home, the only route possible. Shortly after this decision was made, another threat arrived. Again, patrolling German fighters, which had located the straggling bomber, began to pick away. Fortunately, the interceptors must have been low on fuel or ammunition, because with just a short staff of available gunners, 10 horsepower was able to repel them after just a few passes, limping across the coast and continuing over the channel.
As the B-17 carried on, Lieutenant Matthews had to take turns flying with the navigator, Lieutenant Walter Trumper, as the cold air that was blasting through the broken cockpit was too much for one man to bear for long periods of time. Through their determination, however, and without any official training, they powered through and flew the crippled aircraft west as best and as quickly as they could.
After a while, one of the crew was able to repair the radio, and against the odds, 10 horsepower being flown almost exclusively by her ball turret gunner and navigator made it to the coast of England and got in touch with their home base. When they arrived over Polebrook and relayed the seriousness of their situation, the commanding officer, Colonel Eugene Romig, was called to the tower. Upon looking at the aircraft, with the knowledge that no one on board had ever attempted landing a plane, he ordered that the crew bail out and abandon the aircraft.
However, Sergeant Archie Matthews refused. With his pilot critically wounded and unconscious in the seat, they determined that he was unable to be moved from the cockpit, meaning that a bailout would kill him. Thus, Matthews couldn't leave him to die, and so instead, a compromise was made.
Matthews took the bomber and flew over Polebrook, where the remaining 5 members of the crew bailed out, while he and the navigator, Lieutenant Trumper, volunteered to stay with the plane and attempt to land while being instructed over the radio. Rather than sitting idly by, Colonel Romig and the tower officer opted to take up another B-17, named My Princess, to try and talk them down through the landing from nearby. But as they got into the air and joined 10 horsepower, it became apparent that they might be more of a risk than a help, as the bomber was flying so sporadically that a collision was a serious risk. Nonetheless, though, they continued and tried to walk the gunners through a landing at Polebrook. Unfortunately, the young crew members at the controls of 10 horsepower came in too high and too fast and were forced to abort and go around. Shortly thereafter, Colonel Romig on My Princess led them again for a second attempt, but again the sporadically flying bomber came in too high and too hot, leading them to abort the second landing as well. Finally, they would attempt one other landing at a nearby airstrip, but this too proved too challenging, and the crew opted for a new plan. They would now attempt one more landing, but this time they chose an open field nearby the runway. They hoped this would give them a little more space to work with. Thus, Colonel Romig led Archie Matthews and Walter Trumper as they attempted to bring 10 horsepower in one last time.
With their co-pilot already dead and the pilot unconscious, their stress was likely off the charts, knowing that if they were to save Lieutenant Nelson, they had to get the plane down quickly so that he could receive the necessary medical attention.
10 horsepower came upon the field and now had a better approach, lowering speed and bringing the nose down. But this time, the gradient of the terrain was at a difficult angle for their descent, and as soon as the bomber touched down, a tragedy unfolded. The nose of 10 horsepower dug into the muddy English soil, causing the bomber to disintegrate upon impact. As medical crews rushed to the scene of the crash in the nearby field, they found Matthews and Trumper killed at the controls, likely instantly when the plane broke apart. But Lieutenant Nelson, the pilot, was miraculously alive. He was taken to a nearby medical facility, but heartbreakingly, he too would pass away from his injuries later that day. After the incident, both Sergeant Matthews and Lieutenant Trumper would be recommended for the Medal of Honor and would both receive it, with their citation reading as follows.
For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at risk of life above and beyond the call of duty, in action against the enemy, in connection with a bombing mission over enemy-occupied Europe on February 20th, 1944. The aircraft on which Sergeant Matthews was serving as flight engineer and ball turret gunner was attacked by a squadron of enemy fighters, with the result that the co-pilot was killed outright, the pilot wounded and rendered unconscious, the radio operator wounded, and the plane severely damaged. Nevertheless, Sergeant Matthews and other members of the crew managed to right the plane and fly it back to their home station, where they contacted the control tower and reported the situation. Other members of the crew were ordered to jump, leaving Sergeant Matthews and the navigator aboard. After observing the distressed aircraft from another plane, their commanding officer decided the damaged plane could not be landed by the inexperienced crew and ordered them to abandon it and parachute to safety, demonstrating unsurpassed courage and heroism. Sergeant Matthews and the navigator replied that the pilot was still alive but could not be moved and they would not desert him. They were then told to attempt a landing. After 2 unsuccessful efforts, the plane crashed into an open field in a third attempt to land. Sergeant Matthews, the navigator, and the wounded pilot were killed in the crash.
Both Archie Matthews and Walter Trumper gave their lives not only for their country, but for their friend, Lieutenant Nelson, as they tried to save his life on one of their first missions in their combat tour. If you enjoyed this video, please consider joining my Patreon at the link below and get your name here on the supporter wall behind me, at least when I'm not using it for cool animations like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.